Good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us for tonight's Morris-Jumel Mansion virtual parlor chat. Tonight's topic, historic house museums and the paranormal, a conversation with historic Richmond Town and the Merchant House will begin. My name is Megan Burns. I'm the programs manager for Morris-Jumel Mansion. And this program is a continuation of our virtual parlor chat series. Each third Wednesday of the month, the mansion hosts a series of online chats where we invite experts to discuss topics that explore the history of the mansion and connect it to the present day. With me to talk about tonight's topic of historic houses and the paranormal are my colleagues Emily Hill-Wright, Director of Operations at the Merchant House Museum, and Luke Boyd, Director of Education and Public Programs at Historic Richmond Town. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to take a moment to review some housekeeping notes for how tonight's program will run and share a brief introduction to Morris-Jumel Mansion and its connection to the paranormal. To begin with, tonight's Zoom webinar event is being recorded. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please note that your video and audio are automatically turned off when you enter this webinar space. However, if you choose to remain in the meeting and webinar, you are granting your consent to be recorded. And likewise, since our main modes of communication and question asking will be using the chat or at the end of the presentations in a Q&A where you may ask to be unmuted, if you participate in either of these features, then you will be recorded. Also, as I mentioned, the main way to communicate with the panelists and us and to submit questions and comments is to use the navigation bar at the bottom of your screen. If you have a cursor, you can run it over the bottom and this bar will magically appear. If you have technical questions, have trouble with audio, etc., feel free to use the chat and use the Q&A to submit a question. You may also raise your hand, and this is particularly helpful if you wish to be called upon so that we can unmute you during the Q&A section. And like many of our programs, tonight's program is free, and we would like to invite any of you who are able to help us continue to keep such programs free or low cost if you are able to make a donation this evening. So if you would like to make a donation to Morris-Jumel, there are a few ways that you can do so, either by texting MJM to 44321, clicking the link to our webpage, which will appear shortly in the chat, or by making a check. So again, any and all donations are appreciated. And of course, we also are very thankful and grateful to have so many of you joining us this evening. All right, now on with the show. So, as you can see on your screen, this is a picture of Morris-Jumel Mansion. And so I just would like to take a few minutes to give you a very brief overview of this special historic site in Washington Heights in northern Manhattan and talk about our connection to ghosts and the paranormal. So the house itself was built in 1765 and it has existed on its present site for 255 years. This is our claim to fame as the oldest remaining house in Manhattan, although we know that there were structures built before and there are many older structures such as those which my colleagues will be sharing with you. As you can imagine, the land itself and the house have been the location of many types of human activities, both known and unknown. From early Lenape settlements to Revolutionary War troop movements to everyday human life events like births and deaths. And the mansion itself has had a reputation for being haunted even in the early 19th century. But there's one particular ghost story from its history which really stands out and helped to put this site on the map, unquote, as a paranormal location. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to ask all of you to imagine that you are in the year 1964. It's a crisp fall day, much like today, and it's early in the morning. A group of school children and their teacher are waiting for their school tour to commence, but so far, no one connected with the house. The curator has not arrived yet to open up the doors. So as you can imagine, students being students in the middle of a park are going to run around and play and shout and, cause all sorts of commotion. All of a sudden, a dark figure appears on the second floor balcony of the house. And you can actually see that second floor balcony in the picture to the left-hand side. So imagine that door swinging open. And this woman seems to be elderly. She's wearing a long black dress and some sort of cap on her head. And so the kids continue to be kids and they're horsing around. And so this figure yells at them to be quiet or leave, and then re-enters the house. And so the children and the teacher are a little taken aback. They laugh nervously and they think to themselves, my goodness, we're in for a really interesting field trip. That must be one of the people who, is going to take us on our tour today. So a few minutes later, the house's curator, Mrs. Emma Bingley Campbell, finally appears. She's a bit flustered and out of breath because, as many New Yorkers can relate to, she was commuting by the subway. Things were not running on time. So she apologizes to the group and welcomes them to the site. And they are all excited. The teacher and the kids, they're chattering, oh my goodness, we think we upset somebody who works at the site. This woman came out, told us to be quiet. And Mrs. Campbell's really perplexed. She tells them, that can't possibly be because I'm the only one who has keys to the site. There shouldn't be any staff member there. There's no one who's currently living in the house. So she's mystified. Regardless, she unlocks the door and they start their tour. And the kids are still a little obsessed with the woman that they saw, but Mrs. Campbell sort of, trudges on. And once they go upstairs to the second floor, the kids freeze. And they look over at a large portrait hanging on the wall. And they point to the woman in the middle of the painting. And they say, that's it. That's her. That's the woman we saw this morning on the balcony. And the curator looks back at them and tells them, this is a family portrait of Eliza Jumel, and that they could not have possibly seen her since she has been dead for almost 100 years. As you can imagine, this story generated a lot of media buzz and sparked many ghost hunting investigations that have taken place at the mansion from the 1960s to the present day. Again, here's another image of Eliza Jumel, whom some claim may still be residing in our historic house. If you are a student of the paranormal, Professor Hans Holzer claimed that ghosts do in fact reside at the Manhattan Mansion. Was writing this in 1981, and I believe he has another connection to one of the sites on our panel. So he was really a proponent of these investigations. And in fact, if you are a brave or adventurous or curious soul, we invite you to participate in one of our monthly paranormal historical investigations at Morris-Jumel Mansion. You can see an image of some investigators with one of our paranormal investigators, Vinnie Carbone. We work with him and others for a 3-hour evening experience using different technologies such as this K2 EMF meter, which detects bursts of energy to see if in fact there are spirits in the house. And in fact, so many different types of occurrences happen, ranging from sounds to sharp temperature changes, smells, even images or things appearing out of the corner of your eye that the staff actually keeps a book of haunts log to record and preserve these experiences. So I challenge you, if you are an open-minded skeptic like myself, we do have some upcoming paranormal historical investigations taking place in November, as well as other events coming up later this month and next month, including a new public art installation project called Covida, Homage to Victims of the Pandemic, with local visual artist Andrea Arroyo. So she will be our featured guest next month in November for our virtual Parlor chat. And lastly, I just want to leave you with something to think about before I turn it over to Emily. Look closely at this picture. Do you see anything odd or that stands out to you? This picture was taken a few years ago by a local photographer at an event called Madam's Masquerade. It was a ball, and as you can see, it had been raining earlier that evening. So he very patiently waited for all the guests to file inside. He wanted some clear shots of the exterior with the beautiful lighting. And one of our staff members at the time, once he received the pictures, called the photographer to ask him, who was that person standing or moving on the porch when you were taking these exterior shots? And the photographer was very perplexed, and he was adamant, and he said, I deliberately waited until everyone went inside. He took a rapid succession of shots. And so the first and third of the sequence, there was no one there. But as you can see, in the second, it was a different story. Paranormal? We don't know. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint and turn it over to Emily Hill-Wright, who is joining us from Merchant House, the Merchant's House Museum. And Emily has a degree in American History from Barnard College and a Master of Arts in Museum Studies from NYU. She has been with the Merchant House Museum since 2012. Please join me in welcoming Emily.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'm really excited to be here tonight. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Merchant's House, the museum is located on East 4th Street in Lower Manhattan. And according to the New York Times, we are Manhattan's most haunted house. So I'm looking forward to sharing a few of our ghost stories with you tonight and talking a little bit about how we as a museum interact with our ghosts. There we go. So first, a little bit of background. The Merchant's House was built in 1832 in what was then known as the Bond Street area. It's one of New York's first wealthy residential enclaves. In 1835, the house was sold to a hardware merchant by the name of Seabury Tredwell. Seabury and his wife, Eliza, lived in the house with their 8 children for nearly 100 years. 5 years after they bought the house, in 1840, Eliza gave birth to the couple's 8th and final child, a daughter named Gertrude. Gertrude was the only one of her siblings to be born in the house, and she lived there her entire life. She never married, and she died in the house in 1933, so nearly 100 years after her father had purchased the home. Between 1838 and 1933, 8 Tredwell family members died in the house. As was the custom in the 19th century, their wakes and funerals were held in the front parlor. Shortly after Gertrude died, a relative of the family made arrangements to turn the house into a museum, and the museum actually opened to the public in 1936. And so today, the house is remarkably intact, complete with the Tredwell family's original furniture, their decorative arts, their books, their personal possessions, and even their clothing. Perhaps it is no surprise then that the Tredwell family might choose to stick around such a time capsule. In fact, the very first ghost story we have in the museum's files took place before the museum even opened, back in 1933. It was a hot day in September, and the neighbors were all sitting out on their stoops enjoying the beautiful weather like we have in New York in the late summer, early autumn. And some children were playing noisily in the street outside the house when suddenly the door flew open and a frail elderly woman in a long dress rushed out, waving her arms to shoo the children away. All of the neighbors saw this happen, and all of them recognized her as Gertrude Tredwell. However, Gertrude had died the month before in August of 1933, and the house at the time was completely unoccupied. This is the bedroom of Eliza Tredwell, the matriarch of the family. Over the years, so many strange things have happened in this room that we actually consider this to be the most haunted room in the house. Take note of this mirror that you see here between the windows. We will come back to it. Here's a photo taken by a museum visitor in Eliza Tredwell's bedroom in front of the fireplace here. After the photo was developed, this is of course before digital photography, so they had to have your film developed, the visitor noticed this strange streak running through the photo. And here is another photograph taken in this room during a wedding in 1996, again with a nearly identical streak of light. These photos were taken years apart, taken by different photographers, taken with different cameras. The cameras and the negatives were all examined afterwards, and nothing was found to be amiss. But both of these photos feature this strange streak of energy or light. And it's actually, if you look closely, in exactly the same place, just in front of the fireplace here in Eliza's bedroom. Remember this mirror? This is a close-up of a photo taken by another museum visitor in Eliza's bedroom. And again, after she had her film developed, she noticed what appeared to be a man reflected in the mirror. The visitor was alone in the room at the time that she took this photo, and of course, we at the museum have rope barriers up to prevent visitors from getting too close to the furnishings inside the period rooms. Over the years, we have tried to recreate this photo, but we've actually been unable to do so without the photographer standing so close to the mirror that they would themselves be in the photo. So we still to this day have no explanation for this. When visitors, volunteers, or staff have paranormal experiences in the house, we try to get their story in their own words and to record it if at all possible. And so here is a museum visitor detailing her experience meeting a member of the Tredwell family. I'd recommend you turn the sound on your computer up just to make sure you can hear what she has to say.
It was a beautiful summer day in 1999, and I was walking down Lafayette Street with my boyfriend and my young son, and I saw this intriguing sign that said the Merchants House Museum. So we went in and we started a self-guided tour, and on the second floor I walked into Gertrude Tredwell's bedroom. There was no one in the room, and there was a closet with a plexiglass door across from the bed in which there were pictures of people in 19th century clothes. So I pressed my face up against the plexiglass to get a better look at the photos. And then suddenly I was overwhelmed by this potent smell, mothballs, and this clear voice that sounded exactly like the Pepperidge Farm man, and it said, "Looking at the family, eh?" An elderly man was standing uncomfortably close to me, and the smell was so strong that I felt as though I might faint. His face was very, very close to mine, and I could see boils on it. And he was wearing a long woolen overcoat, which was very, very strange because it was a hot summer day. And then he said, "There's so-and-so. He built the house." And I was really freaked out by the smell on his face, which looked very worn, and he looked threadbare as though he'd had a tough life. And then he said, "I knew him very well." And at that point, I thought, this guy is a nut, because I had just read that the house was built in the 1830s. And I suddenly heard my boyfriend and my son walk in from the back bedroom. And I turned to them, grimacing with his face that was saying, "Help." And they looked puzzled, and they said, "What's wrong?" And I turned to my right, and there was nobody there. And we walked into the hallway on the second floor where the landing is. We walked to the back bedroom. We didn't see anyone. We walked down the stairs, and then I heard the front door click, and there was the guy again, and he said, "You come back and visit us." The door slammed, and I ran up to the front windows, and I didn't see anyone. And I was very disturbed by this experience. And as we were leaving, my knee suddenly buckled underneath me, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I said to my boyfriend, "My God, that guy was a ghost. That guy was not alive." And I walked up to a docent who was in the back, and I said, "Have you ever had strange things occur here?" And the docent said, "What do you mean, the ghost?" "Did you see a man or a woman?" And I said, "A man." And the docent said, "Well, that's more unusual. If I can show you some pictures, do you think that you could recognize the person?" And amongst the pictures was a portrait of a young man, and immediately recognized him as the man with whom I'd spoken, however, at least 30 years younger. And I said to the docent, "That's the guy. Absolutely, that's the guy." And he said, "Well, that's Samuel." And that's how I met Samuel.
An interesting note about Samuel Tredwell. When Seabury Tredwell died in 1865, he left each of his children $10,000, a substantial sum in 1865. All of his children, that is, except Samuel. Seabury thought that Samuel was bad with money, and so set up a trust to protect the inheritance. So you see, this is Seabury Tredwell's will here. We've got sum of $10,000 to each at the top, but then we get into Samuel Lennox Tredwell in trust. So when the visitor describes Samuel as looking worn and threadbare, as though he had had a difficult life, that corresponds to what we actually know about Samuel Tredwell's life. But of course, the visitor would have had no way of knowing that. In 2007, the museum partnered with Dan Sturges, founder of Sturges Paranormal and a paranormal expert on the Travel Channel's weekly program, Paranormal Caught on Camera, to try to get to the bottom of the decades of unexplained phenomena. In 2007, like I said, Dan does regular investigations at the museum, including monthly investigations, one a month for a whole year back in 2011. During an investigation, Dan and his team set up audio and video recorders. They track environmental conditions in the house, and they take hundreds of photographs, both in search of spirits and also to document the position of their equipment. Over the last 13 years, Dan has captured an astonishing amount of evidence at the Merchant's House. And the vast majority of the evidence that he has captured to date consists of EVP, which is electronic voice phenomena. EVP are voices that are not heard during recording, but show up later upon reviewing the recordings. So during an investigation, Dan will set up audio recorders and then he'll ask questions, hoping for some kind of a response. And when we're lucky, one of the recorders in the room will pick up something. what I find interesting about EVPs is that often Dan will set up multiple recorders in a room, and he'll ask a question. And so you'll hear the question on all of the recorders, but occasionally the response only comes back on one of the recorders in a room. And so if it were a person, you would expect to hear it on all of the recorders. So that's an interesting little fact about the EVPs. I'm going to play for you now one of my favorite EVPs from a recent investigation recorded in Eliza's bedroom. You will hear our guest investigator, Holly, ask Mrs. Tredwell if she can use the mirror in her room. And then you will hear board member Anthony Belov ask Mrs. Tredwell if she thinks Holly is pretty. So listen very closely for the response.
Mrs. Tredwell, is it all right if I use your mirror to fix my hair?
Do that. I'll take a picture.
Do you think Holly's a pretty girl?
You can be honest, it's okay. You can be honest, it's okay.
Pleasant enough. Pleasant enough.
So you can see Mrs. Tredwell seems to have a sense of humor there with her pleasant enough response. Earlier this year, of course, the Merchant's House was closed to the public due to COVID-19. We realized, though, that the lack of visitors meant that it was a great chance to do some really in-depth paranormal investigations of the house. And so Dan Sturges partnered with a scientist, Dr. Lee, who has actually invented special cameras and audio recorders specifically for the Merchant's House. These cameras were running 24/7, and an empty house meant that they were able to actually set up grids of sensors to truly pinpoint where in a room activity was happening. They got some really interesting findings and are still going through the evidence, but Dan has said it's really brought what he's done at the museum for the last 13 years to a whole new level. If you'd like to find out more about what Dan and Dr. Lee uncovered, you can join us starting this Friday, October 23rd, for Lingering in the Shadows, a virtual exploration of the museum's haunted history, as well as an unveiling of the latest findings. Next week on the 29th and 30th at 9 p.m., Dan will actually be joining us to co-host to answer any special questions you might have. We are also hosting a virtual Halloween party on Halloween night, so we would love to see you there. And don't miss that first week of November, the next in our series of virtual Behind the Ropes tour. This one all about changing tastes in 19th century furniture. Our Behind the Ropes tours are a fan favorite every year, so we're excited to be able to offer them virtually. So that's the end of my spiel here for
Great. Well,
evening.
thank you, Emily. I know that we've gotten a few comments in the chats about how spooky it was to hear people talk about their experiences and to be able to listen. Have you or any of your colleagues, ever participated in one of the paranormal events there and had any experiences?
Yeah, so I have not had any experiences in the house. I would say that, as you said at the beginning, I would consider myself an open-minded skeptic, but lots of people that I know really well, both colleagues and also volunteers at the museum have had a lot of really interesting experiences. One of my favorite stories that I didn't share in my presentation was one of our volunteers was actually working the day after Christmas, and all the visitors were gone. She was closing up the house at the end of the day, and she heard this ringing and couldn't figure out what it was. Went outside, looked up and down 4th Street, nothing happening, but this ringing, ringing, ringing. And then she realized that it sounded like it was coming from inside the house downstairs. And she went down to the kitchen where we have servant call bells.
Kind of like Downton Abbey.
Downton Abbey, yeah. And as soon as she got to the kitchen, the ringing stopped. But she was sufficiently freaked out by that. And she's been a longtime volunteer, and I trust her word. I know that she's an honest person and would never make something up.
Yeah. How about you, Luke? Before we sort of segue over to you, have you had any paranormal experiences at historic Richmond Town or elsewhere, or have your colleagues?
Well, it's early for me yet. I started here less than a year ago, so I'm still getting to know the place myself, but I'm actually on the campus right now. And if anyone wants to make their presence known, they can do so at this time.
We always want to
Richmond-
ask politely.
Yes, yes, dignify the experience. But yes, my staff, the team, the education team in particular, has had a lot of experiences with unexplained bumps in the night, even during the day. And the way it works here is that there's a lot of buildings on our campus, and oftentimes a staff member might be the last person in the building or alone in the building, and so you only have yourself to look at in terms of the evidence. But absolutely, a lot of stories.
A lot of the stories in the Book of Haunts, and like we've got stories from the 1960s in the archives. It seems like there's a fair number of incidents that occur at that person alone, closing up, no rational explanation for any sort of noises other than them. Creepy. All right. Well, so let's turn it over to Luke. And so Luke Boyd here is the Director of Education and Public Programs at Historic Richmond Town. And he has worked in museums for more than 10 years, including the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, and the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. So take it away, Luke.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks everyone for joining us. Emily, also, it was so great to hear your testimony once again. So in case you haven't been to historic Richmond Town in Staten Island, it is New York City's living history village. So it is different from the Merchants House Museum and the Morris-Jumel Mansion and Museum in terms of scale. We occupy 100 acres and over 30 buildings are in our care. And the buildings that we collect and house and preserve are hundreds of years old. Some of the oldest houses in New York State are part of our campus. So it is obvious, it is natural that we would have many ghost stories collected in our sites. We not only interpret the lives of people who lived here and talk about how they lived and what they dressed and what they did for work, but also the story of their death is sometimes baked into the stories that we tell as well. Historic Richmond Town is also surrounded by cemeteries. There's a Hebrew cemetery across the street on Clark Avenue. There is a small cemetery, the Rousseau Van Pelt Cemetery, within the confines of our facility, right next to the courthouse building that you saw in the previous slide. This is one of the oldest family cemeteries. It's in really good shape for its age. It goes back to the 1700s. And we also have two churches nearby, the Church of St. Andrew, an Episcopal church, and a Catholic church, St. Patrick's. And so there's a great deal of life and death being celebrated throughout the fabric of historic Richmond Town. So these are some great photos of the Rousseau Van Pelt Cemetery, early French Huguenots who came to this country. These are great Victorian details that we can see on the cemetery fence, the gate. The winged hourglass is a favorite of mine, the idea of time flying, appreciating life while we have it, sort of urns and different images that we see throughout this small little cemetery. I want to focus in on this one stone, Jacob Rousseau and Susanna Van Pelt. So that's how the two families came together. When Susanna Van Pelt died in 1863, this stone was erected. And I want to read for you the epitaph on this stone, which you cannot see in this photograph. Granddaughter of Jacob Rousseau Sr., and the last of 5 generations interred in this burying ground. They were Huguenots who left France when persecuted for their religion, settled in this neighborhood. They selected this spot for their last resting place on earth. Sacred be their dust. Just gives you a sense of the mourning culture of the time in which these individuals lived. So I'm going to detail several stories that are well known to people who have visited Richmond Town, who have come to After Dark tours, or our own paranormal experiences, tours that we've had throughout the years. We also have worked with Mr. Carbone, who's worked at Morris-Jumel, and other experts who have come to suss out the spiritual and the unexplained at our site. And so I think to go temporally through time, the best story to start with is the legend of Pretty Van Pelt. This is a story of a young lady who lived in Richmond Town, which was also known as Richmond Village, Cocklestown. It had many names before it sort of settled into Richmond. So I want to take us back to the same time of Eliza Jamel. This is the Revolutionary era. There's a young lady living in the village, and she was so enchanting that her nickname was Pretty Van Pelt. We know that the Van Pelt family were patriotic. We also know that in 1776, in July of that year, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, a massive force of British soldiers came to occupy Staten Island, and they would stay here for 7 years. And many soldiers would be quartered in the home of the citizenry of Staten Island. And the Van Pelts, who lived in the middle of Richmond Town, were a part of that story. And so there's an image here of a Hessian soldier. Of course, a Hessian soldier was essentially a German mercenary working for the British Army. So let me tell this story to you, and I think it's best if we rely upon an early narrator to do this. There's a written account of the story of Pretty Van Pelt and the Hessian soldier who came to befriend her. An elderly member of the Van Pelt family would pen this description in the 19th century, in the 1800s. It so reads: in August 1776, a Hessian drummer named Ernst, or Ernest, belonging to a Hessian company, was quartered at the Van Pelt house. The family were Staten Island Dutch and patriots. The youngest member of the household was a little girl of 3 or 4 summers, the darling of her home and the pet of the village. So lovely and engaging was the child that by common consent she was known by the name of Pretty. Ernst the Hessian had a gentle heart. When Pretty, in her artless way, told him of her friends and relatives who were away fighting for liberty, he listened and loved the child, and Pretty loved him. He taught her how to dance to the rataplan of his drum. In the corner of the room, next to the great fireplace, she was wont to stand on the table while Ernst, sometimes on his drum, sometimes on the table, rattled off lively airs, which the tiny feet kept time. At length, when the Indian summer came, Pretty began to change. She became sick with fever, grew worse, and the drum and the dance were still. Ernst hung round her pillow in sore anguish. One evening, as the night shadows fell, with strange presentiment, he said, Pretty will die, and I shall be buried with her. And so this is all folklore. We're not sure exactly what happened here. But what follows is very interesting. According to the story, Pretty Van Pelt would die soon after. And in the days following, in October of 1776, Ernst would also die in a skirmish near Richmond Town, near the church of St. Andrew. And so the two were buried side by side, allegedly in the same cemetery that I showed you, the Rousseau Van Pelt Cemetery. However, no headstone survives chronicling this, and there's no historical evidence that tells us this, but it is a very beguiling story. And so oftentimes in proximity to the cemetery, many people have seen a young lady, a little girl in a sort of colonial garb, haunting the nearby cemetery, just a spectral appearance. Unexplained noises in one of the oldest houses in the village, the Voorlezer's house, are often attributed to Pretty Van Pelt. So these stories that we have, that we know of certain individuals, are often linked to the unexplained. Is that Pretty Van Pelt? Is it Edward Reinhardt? And so forth, so on and so forth. So that's one of the main specters, one of the greatest players in the story. So that takes us to the 1770s. But what about in the 19th century? You may know the story of Edward Reinhardt. In 1877, so 100 years later, Staten Island resident Edward Reinhardt, who owned a candy and tobacco store in Stapleton, murdered his wife, Annie Degnam. He secretly buried her in Silver Lake Park, and the crime was revealed 2 months later when boys playing in the park accidentally unearthed a barrel in which Reinhardt had placed Annie's body. In May of 1879, he was convicted of first-degree murder in the courtroom of the 3rd County Courthouse. Now, behind the courthouse was a jail, The jail is no longer standing. And so Reinhardt was housed in this jail and he was sentenced to death. And during his imprisonment, this whole story was huge, central in Staten Island life. It was gobbled up by the local press, and people were raptured by this story. And Reinhardt sort of basked in this fame. He would write and draw murals on the walls of his cell. He apparently befriended and kept 2 large cats with him in his cell and sort of entertained a stream of guests. At the end of his sentence in 1881, he was sentenced to death by hanging. So he was hanged right outside the jail. So if you come to the parking lot in historic Richmond Town, right behind the courthouse, that is where the jail was. And so if anything, that is where the energy of this experience lives. So it is believed that many sightings in the historical museum, which is across the street, things that go bang, unexplained phenomena. There's been examples of a facilities worker in the courthouse setting up chairs for an event the next day, only to come up moments later and the chairs are all strewn about. Unexplained noises. And I myself have been the last person out of these buildings at night, and I've been susceptible to some interesting thoughts that go across one's mind. So Reinhardt is sort of a nefarious character that appears in many of these stories. But I would be remiss if I did not mention the Guyan Lake Tyson house. And this is a really interesting wrinkle in the story. So similar to Megan's story of the children being disturbed by a sighting, there have been several occasions in which field trips to the Guyan Lake Tyson house have been interrupted, enhanced if you were, changed by an encounter with a specter. Many children have reported seeing young boys or girls in the Guyan Lake Tyson house. The sad tragedy is that the Lake and Tyson families each lost 4 children or so. So 8 children total we know died. And they died in the house over the course of the life cycle of these families. So we see this often, this story of loss of children echoing in these historic houses. And what's interesting about this, ladies and gentlemen, is that the Guyan Lake Tyson house was not always here. It was moved to this present location from 2 miles away. So what I mean to say is that all these experiences of the paranormal that happened in the Guyan Lake Tyson house occurred centuries after these people expired, but also physically in a different place altogether. So did the spirits of the paranormal follow in the structure, even though it was lifted and disassembled and put back together? I think that's an interesting question that we have the great benefit at Historic Richmond Town of exploring, in that we have original structures that were part of the landscape, but we also have these structures that were moved here and how that history follows it. And a new story is told in its new landscape. So I would encourage you to come to Historic Richmond Town. The grounds are open. We're open for tours as well on the weekends. Some further reading. One of our great friends is Professor Patricia Salmon. Her book, Murder and Mayhem on Staten Island, is an excellent read into some of these illicit stories. We have some events coming up the end of this month as well. Halloween in Richmond Town on October 31st at Decker Farm. We're going to be having pumpkin picking with a Halloween mind to it. There's the pumpkin.
Oh,
And
nice.
then we're also having a haunted sort of like a old-time radio hour, Odd Occurrences, in which we're going to be reading 1940s radio plays with some modern twists and some spooky characters who will appear. This will all be outdoors and it's going to be great. So I think that's all the time I have, but thank you.
Are you going to help with some of like the sound effects for them?
We have some great actors and performers who will be there to lend an air of spookiness for sure. But it looks like it's going to be a really fantastic event. Radio theater is so fun. It's a great sensory experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Luke, for sharing some of the tales of historic Richmond Town. And I believe you also mentioned that the gravestones as well have been relocated.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's really not enough time to go into all these stories, but we know there's a gentlelady who works at our site and she's encountered a spirit in the museum who I didn't even talk about, who apparently died in the museum. But also, several cemeteries in Staten Island were buried by modern 20th century infrastructure. Okay, so the Fresh Kills landfill, for example, when Robert Moses was sort of building that and other great projects, some cemeteries were essentially destroyed, and some plots were moved, but headstones were left behind. And so some of those headstones are in our collection, and they're in the basement of some of our buildings. And so it's just really creepy, and it begs a whole other question about again, things being moved, buildings, headstones, all this stuff. What comes along with it? What baggage does it bring? It's interesting.
Absolutely. Well, so our chat and our questions have been coming in. So if I could ask you, Luke, have you stopped screen sharing?
I will now.
Let's see if we can all reconvene and take some questions. Meg and Shiloh, do you have some questions for us?
We're getting lots of interesting questions tonight.
I bet.
So we'll start off with a question from one of our docents, Karen Compton, who, if you all want to look at the Q&A, she has shared some of her own experiences. She wants to know, Megan, you asked the others, what about you? Have you had any experiences?
Well, I've had some things I haven't been able to explain. So oftentimes it's when I'm by myself, I've closed the park, I'm the only one in the house. I'm working in my office on the 3rd floor. One time I thought I heard like whispering, indistinct whispering close by. And Meg, you also were there for last weekend when we were in one of the more active spots in the mansion, the 18th century kitchen. And silly me, I thought that picking a spot on the bench with my back to the doorway wasn't going to be problematic. But Vinny, our paranormal investigator, put sort of light or motion sensor activated lights on different stairs. And one of us, I think it was either you or him, asked if there was anyone present, could they please make their presence known, come down the stairs. And lo and behold, over my shoulder, I saw the lights go on slowly, one by one in sequential order. And I'm like, okay, I think I'm going to move and sit somewhere else. How about you, Meg?
Yeah, I've definitely had some experiences. I've heard noises. I've had some olfactory experiences, and some, meaning I smelled a very strong smell of cigar smoke in the dining room. And I've also smelled that typical old lady rose scented perfume in Eliza Jamel's bedroom. And when you may not realize that what your workplace smells like, but you do notice changes in that in the workplace. So yeah, I've definitely had some experiences like that, as well as changes in temperature that were pretty significant and shared with the rest of our guests.
I see another question for Luke and Emily here. The question is, why do you think that certain folks haunt and other departed ancestors don't? Are they being mischievous, or do they not know if they are dead?
A great question, and I think one that we would all love to know the answer to. I think, what Dan Sturges, our paranormal investigator, has said about the hauntings, at the Merchant's House, is that that one family lived there for 98 years. And that in some instances you see hauntings because it's a place of trauma, something bad happened. But at the Merchant's House, it really just seems to be that this is just where they lived their lives. Their things are all still there, their furniture, their personal possessions. And so it's just sort of a continuation that, Gertrude lived 93 years of her life inside that house, and she's going to keep on doing it even after death.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that at the Merchant's House, it's none of the experiences that people have had, while they might be frightening, it's not because anyone has ever felt that there's a sort of an oppressive presence or something. Malicious, exactly. It really just seems to be, one of our docents told a visitor once that, they're just trying to make sure that we're taking good care of the house.
It's a nice way of looking at it. Do either you, Luke, or Emily have any routines about things that you do or say if you enter a place that may have activity? For instance, when we open the house, we always say good morning to Eliza and Eliza-Jumel and good night. Want to be polite.
I think certain staff definitely treat certain buildings differently. With like 30 structures, and I interviewed the staff, and some be like, well, this building, it really freaks me out. And then another one would say, well, I'd never go to this building because it's got something going on in it. So everyone has their own take on every structure.
And strategies, whether it's
That's
avoidance
it.
or, yeah. Great. Any other questions coming in from the chat, Meg, or any questions that you all have on the panel?
I saw one that was talking about historic sites dismissing lore, and I just thought, based on the conversations that we had going into this program, that might be something we could spend some of our time on. I think that paranormal tourism, as it were, is a wonderful way to draw people to museums who might not otherwise visit it for the standard reasons that we envision. And some people are very much purists and would say, well, we don't want to spend time doing this, or this because it doesn't advance the story. Whereas for me, it's an opportunity to say, sure, I want to validate your experience, and I hope that you find what you're looking for, but also it's an opportunity to learn something too. So, and I hope that was part of it tonight. I mean, just hearing the story of the Tredwells, of the Jumels, it's fascinating. And you always get some great nuggets from that. So there's an exchange that goes back and forth. So I'm into it, so long as the goal is something, universal in terms of education.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for the Merchant's House, and because we have had a paranormal reputation for such a long time, there was a real effort throughout much of the 20th century to distance ourselves from this sort of reputation. A few years ago, in the midst of an institutional archive project, the archivist showed me a docent training manual from I think it was the 1970s. And in the docent training manual for the house, it said in big bold letters, "Do not talk about ghosts." Which is just so, it shows that that was something that people were talking about, that visitors were asking about, that docents had experiences with, but it was clear that the museum wanted to sort of distance itself from that maybe you're not a serious museum if you talk about ghosts. But I mean, I agree with you completely, Luke, that it's such a wonderful way of bringing in audiences who might not be traditional museum goers. And then once they see the space, they, fall in love with it and stick around. So
absolutely. And that's kind of been, our approach for, recent years at Morris-Jumel Mansion. Although, if I were to go back to that Hans Holder sort of letter to the editor, he kind of castigates the Daughters of the American Revolution for denying it. And he's like, well, ghosts were there and they are there, and whether you acknowledge them or not. But yeah, as long as it engages interest, and, as educators, we all sprinkle in a little bit of history and keep them asking for more. All right. I believe someone has a question for you, Emily, about, is there anywhere visitors can hear more of those testimonies that were recorded?
Oh, yeah. So you should check our website and come to our Lingering in the Shadows presentation. We're offering several nights of that over the next couple weeks. In a normal year, which this is very much not, in October, we would be doing candlelight ghost tours of the house. And so hopefully the city will one day return to normal. So you can keep an eye on our website. We do usually 10 nights of candlelight ghost tours in October. And then we also do monthly candlelight ghost tours. So once we are able to have decent sized groups back at the museum again, we will pick that back up again. But in the meantime, your best bet to hear more firsthand stories is to come to our Lingering in the Shadows presentation.
Great. And then Luke, how might people learn more about the paranormal experiences at your site? You recommended that book. Do you have any other sort of suggestions for them?
Yes, we don't really have any assets online right now, but we're going through a virtual revamp of like an outdoor walking tour experience. We also have a great outdoor exhibit that's being built as we speak that deals with the invisible buildings of Richmond Town. So we have like 30 buildings, but then we have like 12 more that were demolished, destroyed, whatever. And so they're sort of ghost buildings, if you were. And within them, there's all kinds of interesting stories, like the jail, for an example. You know, we talked about the jail with a big sign in the middle of the parking lot. So by way of invisible buildings, ghost buildings, you can exhume the history a little bit for yourself.
I know that we are at time. So those of you, if you wish to stay on, if the panelists are interested in staying for another 5 minutes, there's a really great question in the Q&A who said, just curious if anyone has ever considered helping the ghosts move on, why or why not? So I don't know if that is something that you want to tackle, or if there are some friends of each of the museums who are present who might want to speak to that. I believe Anthony Belov, are you still here?
Hi, Anthony, if you're here.
Let's see. Meg, can we if he wishes to talk?
While we're waiting, we did have a really interesting question. Wondering if all of us took our jobs at the museums knowing that they were haunted. Yeah, that was, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing, but L'Oreal wants to know, did our employers hint that there may be spirits? I don't know if anyone wants to answer that.
I mean, I was aware, but as a women's historian, I loved the centuries of strong female women like Eliza Jumel and Mary Phillips Morris and Anne Northrop, and really wanted to delve into those stories. So less paranormal for me.
I think most of us assume that the places we are going to work in museums are haunted in some level, and sort of take that for granted. And also, as history people, we would love nothing more than to converse with our historical heroes, you know, either through with a DeLorean or with a specter, you know. So yeah, I think so.
How about you, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, it's, yes, I absolutely knew that there was a reputation. The museum does not shy away from talking about our ghosts. And it's, I mean, it's an important part of our yearly programming. It's an important part of what we do as a museum each year. We also use our ghosts in October typically to talk about 19th century death and mourning practices. So it really is a way of, you know, talking about ghosts, but also talking about historical issues and educating. So yes. Yep.
And human experiences, right?
If I may jump in, hi, it's Anthony.
Yes.
Hi,
Great, Anthony. Hi.
Hi, everybody. I'm really enjoying this so much. I want to expound on what Emily just had to say, because about 10 years ago, I was invited to talk at the American Association of State and Local Histories annual meeting, and it was in Beauport, Texas, and it was specifically about how we have embraced our paranormal reputation without compromising the museum's mission, as an educational institution. And I had this whole presentation ready, including showing them the video presentation that we show ghost tours visitors. Some of it's actually available on YouTube in a shortened version.
Oh, great.
And also about what Luke was talking about earlier in the evening. I was kind of surprised, and it was almost documentational, if there is such a word, that the institutions north of the Mason-Dixon line were extremely interested and open to what we were doing at the Merchant's House. And I had a lot of one-on-one conversations with representatives of those museums after the fact, whereas the historic houses south of the Mason-Dixon line were vehemently opposed to the idea of embracing the paranormal in any way. And the Bible was mentioned a number of times during that heated discussion. And I was reminded that there are marked cultural distinctions, not just North and South, but amongst different cultural groups as well. And I think part of an institution's culture would determine whether or not they wanted to proceed with something like this. If it's done respectfully, if it's done within the confines of an accredited museum's mission statement, I see nothing wrong with it. Obviously, Emily really hit the nail right on the head by describing that we're attracting alternative audiences with the intention that hopefully they'll come back for a more standard museum experience. And to address the second question, which was the one I was invited to mention, it's a great question. Has anyone ever thought of helping these spirits, if that's what they are, because we don't know that for a fact, on to whatever they're supposed to be moving on to? One of the EVPs, one of the voice recordings that we received in one of our investigations, all of which I've attended, because lucky me, I'm the museum rep who has been embroiled in the paranormal investigation since the start, simply because I've been there longer than anybody else, and I have accumulated more paranormal occurrences than anybody else. But we did ask into an empty room, why are you still here? And a male voice responded, again, only audible when we played the recording back, because you remember. And I immediately, when it was played back to me, and this was several weeks later, I jumped. I was speaking with Dan Sturges on the phone, and he played it for me. And I jumped immediately and said, you don't think we're forcing them to stay here, do you? And he felt not. We've never had a discussion about inviting them to leave. And I find the question very interesting, and it's a very loaded question.
Well, to add a little levity to that conversation, our museum director, Pi Gardner, has said before that with real estate in New York the way it is, why would anyone leave?
Good point.
Agreed. That's a fair point. All right. Well, there's so many interesting comments and questions still going in the chat, but sadly, our time together is coming to a close. However, I want to thank my co-presenters, Luke and Emily, Eliza Jumel herself, and my colleague Meg for helping bring this program to life and field all your questions. And also especially thank all of the visitors tuning in from near and far and asking such really thought-provoking questions. We really hope to see you again, either online or on site at our historic sites. Thank you and good night.